Hey guys, on a short break, but we're running a little late, so we're gonna move on forward. All right. Cool. So we're gonna jump ahead forward into JavaScript. Real quick, for those of you who are here, like that, again, I hope you guys got a little bit out of Git and GitHub out of that. Maybe you learned something you didn't know. Can I just get a quick raise of hands? Who thought that was too fast? Okay. Who thought that was approximately at the right speed? And who thought that was too slow? Okay. So maybe I'm leaning on the faster side, so maybe I'll slow it down. Hopefully we'll see how JavaScript works. And don't worry, I'll be asking multiple times throughout this lecture to see how the pace is going, okay? So yeah, JavaScript. This is fun, okay? This is exciting. First of all, if you're completely new to programming and you've never done any side of programming before, I'm going to tell you right now, I can't do a good job of teaching an entire programming language in an hour. That's just not possible. I don't think anyone can. So there are really good resources online, including Codecademy, but they basically have these really nice tutorials online where they have an editor in the web and you can type out code and it'll automatically do everything for you, and they have really nice lessons. And basically that will also basically do what I'm going to do, but also teach you the fundamentals of programming, hopefully. Because the purpose of this next lecture is not to teach you how to program, because again, I can't do that in an hour. But the fundamentals is hopefully to show you some of the nice syntax of JavaScript. Nice. But some of the syntax of JavaScript and get people who know how to program in other languages over to JavaScript, as well as maybe introduce some of the newcomers to the concepts of JavaScript. But yeah, if you guys don't know it, this will take probably several hours to get through, but it's highly recommended if you've never programmed before. So yeah, let's do a quick recap. So HTML describes the content and structure of a web page. CSS describes the presentation of a web page, makes stuff pretty. And JavaScript is the programming language used to manipulate the content of the web page and make it interactive. Okay? So my take on JavaScript: if HTML is nested boxes, CSS is a list of box descriptions, then JavaScript is making things happen with boxes. Yeah. What does that mean? Well, let's take a quick side note, because JavaScript and Java, people hear these two things and think like, oh, maybe they're kind of similar. They're not related at all. They're completely two different programming languages. They might look a little similar, but they're quite different, I promise you. It's basically relating like butter to butterfly. It's like not the same thing, okay? So don't make that mistake, okay? All right. So yeah, JavaScript. We're gonna just kind of dive into some like basic concepts about JavaScript. So first of all, JavaScript has 5 primitive data types. Data types are basically types of things you can have in JavaScript. And primitive means like the most lowest level of those things. So there's 5. I'm only showing you 3 for a reason, because I'm going to get to the last 2 in a bit. But there's Boolean. Boolean stands for true and false. Okay, that's all it is. It's just a word that represents those 2 options. Okay, so you can store true and false. You can have numbers, which is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, million, -2, 0.5, like any kind of number. That's a type in JavaScript. And a string, which is like, for those of you who've never done any programming, like string is a really weird word to call it, but like it's like a word or a sentence, anything that you would surround with quotation marks, because it's a list of letters going on and on. That's what string is. There's also 2 more called null and undefined, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay? But let's talk about some variables, okay? Because in programming, obviously, you want to store things in variables. That's kind of the main concept, or one of the main concepts of programming. And so how you do that in JavaScript is use this keyword called let, okay? And you say let space and the name of the variable in any way you want, and then you set equals to some value. The value can be anything you want, okay? And so you can call this variable myBoolean. Note real quick that when you're naming variables, it's good, good coding practice to camel case your variable names. And what that means is you start with a lowercase, and then every time you switch any words, you create an uppercase. So my Boolean is typed out as you see here, and my number and my second number. Every time you create a new word, it's uppercase at the first letter. Okay? So yeah, back to this. A Boolean example is you can set let my Boolean equals true. By the way, it doesn't have to be called my boolean. It can be let a equals true, let b equals true. Okay? You can let my number equal 5, second number equals 5.0. You can let my string equal to something in quotation marks. That's how you define strings, by putting things in between quotation marks. Peanuts and M&Ms. Why? I don't know. So yeah, there's also something called constants in JavaScript. So you can say let a equals 5, and then later you can redefine it and say a equals 7. By the way, once a variable is created, so once you have said let a, you don't have to say let anymore. A exists, and you can set a equals something else later. Okay? So a equals 7, that's totally fine. But if you do something like const b equals 5, then you cannot reassign it ever again. So b equals 10, that's not going to work. That'll run into an error in your code when you run it, because this is not okay. By the way, while we're here, this is how you write comments in JavaScript. You just use 2 slashes. If you use Java, it's the same exact thing, but they're not the same. Okay, so you're probably wondering, why do we have these 2 different things, okay? And so this is the little more high-level conceptual kind of thing, but let creates a normal reference variable. If you know what that is, great. If you don't, it's okay. Basically just creates a value, and you can edit it later. Whereas const creates an immutable reference variable, which you can't reassign, okay? So you can't change this variable after you assign it. And for those of you who know Java, this is kind of like regular variables versus final variables. It's somewhat of a parallel. But again, if you don't understand what that means, it's totally okay. And so why? Why do we have this? What's the point of this? The point is that variables that should never need to be changed should just not be allowed to change. This prevents you from having bugs in your code. Like imagine you created something and someone else goes and edits your code. They don't actually know how all of it works, and maybe they're like, oh, I want to reassign this, but that really should not be reassigned. Then you, as the programmer, can just set it to be a constant in the first place, and then later, this prevents people from having bugs with your code. Okay? And this is just good coding practices. So yeah, then what about this thing called var, right? Because I'm sure maybe some of you have seen JavaScript before, and you might have seen code that looks like this, where they define variables using the keyword var. Okay? And this will work, okay? This will compile, it will run, and you will have a variable called b, it will have a value of 5, and then later it will have a value of 10. But you do not want to do this, okay? In particular, this is old-fashioned, if anything, is the best way to describe it. There are newer and newer releases of JavaScript all the time, and var is an older way of defining variables, and it's less safe than using let and const, okay? So just in general, avoid using var, always use let and const. And by the way, this will be something that you run into because lots of online examples probably still use var, like Stack Overflow posts, some tutorials even, they will try giving you some code using var. So whenever you see it, just go ahead, you can still use their code, but replace it with let. Just do that automatically, because this is just a safe coding practice. If you're curious a little more about what's going on with let and var, you can go ahead and check out this link. It's on the Mozilla Developer Network, and it tells you all about why these 2 things exist, why one's better than the other, etc. So before we jump on, anyone have questions? Anyone have any thoughts? Am I going too fast? Too slow? Normal? Okay, too fast. Too slow. Normal. Okay, all right, take it. So, thank you for your honesty. I like it. So yeah, so cool. So here we are. Next up is types. Okay. So we have these are the 2 more types that I haven't told you about yet. There's null and undefined. Okay. And undefined basically means unassigned, whereas null is just a type of an object that is nothing. It's kind of hard to understand if you've never done any programming before, but basically the idea is, in these 2 examples, you can create a string, let my string equals gummy bears, and then you can also just set it to be null, and that's equal to null. That's what it is. But if you just define a variable and don't assign it to anything, by the way, I keep using these words define and assign. Variable definition is just the part that says let the variable name, and the assignment part of it is equals something else. So these are pretty common terms in programming. So here in the first one we have a variable definition and assignment. Here we just have a variable definition. So yeah, when you just define a variable, it just is automatically undefined. Wait, that makes no sense. Don't worry about what I'm saying. But like basically, if you say let name of a variable, maybe I just messed up. I don't know. But basically, when you just say let the name of the variable, it becomes undefined. Okay. Cool. Of course, in any program, it's probably useful to print things and have some sort of output, like where you saw when we're using the command line, you call these functions and it would print something out to you. And the way JavaScript works is you use this function called console.log, and that will write something to the JavaScript console. And don't worry, we'll look at where that is in Chrome so that you have a good understanding of how you get there. But fast forward, it's just in the inspector kind of area. So yeah, you can type console.log and then in the parentheses put a string, like JavaScript rules, that'll print that out to the console. This is similar to system.out.println in Java, similar to print in Python, same kind of concept. Cool. So there's a data type called arrays. Okay, this is a more, it's not a type, it's like a data structure. Okay, and what this does is basically, it's just basically kind of like a list of items. Don't get confused by like list in terms of like technical programming terminology. It's just a list in the semantic meaning of the word. So yeah, so the way you define it is basically you say, same way on the left side, that you do let cats, okay? It's declaration, not definition, that's what it is. Variable declaration, variable assignment. Anyways, don't worry about that. So yeah, we have declared a variable, let cats, and we've assigned it to an array. And how you write an array is 2 square brackets, okay? And then you put just a comma-separated list of things that you want to store in it. So here we have 3 cats, Persian, Sphinx, Russian, okay? And so there's also helpful methods for arrays, such as push and pop, okay? So you can push Siberian to the end of the array, it just adds it to the end of the array. And if you look at the comment, that's what it would be after, Persian, Sphinx, Russian, Siberian. And then if you pop, it just takes off the thing at the end of the array. And so it's back to Persian, Sphinx, and Russian. Cool. So then next up, you can do that, but you can also print things, or you can access things in arrays. The way you access elements in an array is you use the square bracket notation. So you say the name of the array, cats, and you use square brackets, and then you put a number, which is the index of the array you want to access. Right? So cats1 is getting some element of the array. The interesting thing is you can see it prints Sphinx, and that's because everything in JavaScript is 0 indexed. So when you 0 index something, basically it means that the first element of the array is at index 0. That's why we have workshops 0, 1, 2, 3, because we're programmers. But yeah, so the 1 index of the cats array is actually in the 2nd position. So just always subtract 1. And you'll get Sphinx, okay? And so what this is doing actually is first accessing cats1, getting the value Sphinx, and then passing that as the argument to the function console.log and printing that out. Cool. Next up is a really handy tool in most programming languages called for loops. Hopefully most of you have seen this before. If you haven't, it's a little confusing. But the idea is that it lets you do some bit of code over and over again for some amount of time, okay? And so what that means is we have this section here, which is how you write a for loop in JavaScript. And if you've done Java, it looks very similar. You can do something similar in Python. But basically the idea is everything inside the curly braces. So you can ignore the for and the parentheses, but everything inside the curly braces is what is being executed over and over and over again. So here we're just printing out console logging out some element of cats, okay? We're printing out elements of cats I, and this is what happens in the loop. So I is a variable that you define in the loop, okay? So in the loop header, so you can see we have 3 statements. Let I equal 0, I is less than cats.length, and I++, okay? So there's a whole bunch of new things here that we haven't talked about. First, the first statement is usually used to define some variable. So we have defined I and set it to 0. Okay? And that variable is available for you to use any place inside that loop. So we're going to use it every single time we run the loop. We're going to jump to the last part, I++. That is basically a shortcut for saying I equals I plus 1. and basically it's an increment operator and increments the value of I. Okay? And so that happens at the end of every loop. Okay? So it starts at I equals 0, it executes console.log cat 0, so it prints out Persian, and then it does I++ and increases I to 1. And then after that, you finally execute the middle segment, which is I is less than cats.length. First of all, you can get the length of an array by doing cat.length, right? And then it basically evaluates this Boolean expression. Boolean is being true or false, so this evaluates to something true or false. So at that point, I is equal to 1. 1 is less than cats.length, which is 3. It's 3 long. Okay? So as long as that expression is true, this loop will happen over and over and over again. Okay? So we get from I0, print out Persian, go to I1, it's still true. We do it again, print out Sphinx, go to I equals 2, it's still true. Print out Russian, okay? I is 3, it's no longer true. 3 is not less than 3, okay? So that evaluates to false, and then the loop ends. Hopefully this should be pretty self-explanatory. If this is confusing, definitely go to Code Academy. Finally, objects, okay? So there are things called objects in JavaScript, and they're basically a collection of key value pairs, okay? And so, again, you declare the variable in the same way, let person, okay? And then you put that you set it equal to something inside curly braces, and that's how you say that this is now an object, okay? And so the way you basically declare the object or create the object is you have a bunch of keys and values. And you can see that this person's first name is Rupayan, last name is Yogi, age should be 22, but the eye color is brown. Okay? So we have all these different things. Okay, these are basically properties of an object, and that's kind of self-explanatory. This is me, and this is some parts of who I am. Okay? That's kind of what objects are for. And you know, it kind of looks like CSS if you kind of look at it carefully. So you can kind of relate it to that syntax. So it's slightly different. Remember, CSS ends with semicolons, whereas this is a comma-separated list of different properties and keys and values. So accessing fields of objects is pretty simple. You just use the dot operand, the period, and so you have this object called person, okay? And to get the first name of the person, you do person dot first name, okay? And so you can do that with any of these parameters, these properties of the object. And so you can also do it by using the square bracket notation. So you, somewhat similar to how you access an array, you can go person, square brackets, and then in quotes, the name of the key that you want to access. So person, the string first name. Okay? And so the first two will print Rupayan, the second one will print 21, the third one will print brown. Cool. Before we go into functions, does anyone have questions? Too fast? Too slow? Good? Okay, you guys don't even raise your hands anymore. Alright, so I'll assume that's fine. Okay, next up, functions. So there's a couple ways to declare functions. There's actually more than just these two ways, but we'll start with these two. So again, just like we've been doing all this time, you declare variables using let, and you can store functions inside variables, which is kind of interesting, because everything is kind of a variable. This is a JavaScript weird thing. But yeah, so you let getGreeting be equal to a function. Okay? And functions are defined, they have, first of all, what are functions? They take some value and turn it into something else, or do something with that thing, okay? So we're passing in something called a name. By the way, the parameter that goes into the function can be written as anything. Okay? It can be name, it could be a, it could be my favorite monkey, I don't know, it could be anything. Okay, so you have that, and then inside the curly braces, you say what you're going to do with that value. So you, in this case, I'm returning. Return is a keyword. It basically says this is what the function is going to evaluate to. I'll get to that in a second. But basically, it returns hi plus name plus exclamation mark. And basically, this is a nice little thing you can do with strings. You can just add them together. And you can see if we call getGreeting right here on line 9 with Aaron, it will return hi Aaron exclamation mark. Okay? And by return, I mean this piece of code right here is equivalent to the string hi Aaron exclamation mark. It doesn't print it. It's basically just like as if I just plopped that string right there. Right? And that's what return does. It just basically, you can kind of imagine that this function will be replaced by that. Okay? And similarly, you can also just define functions by just using the second syntax, which is function, and the name of the function, parentheses, and then curly braces, and you do the same thing. So get meow returns, repine says meow, or name says meow, and evaluates to this. Cool. So yeah, next up is equality. Okay, this is like one of those finicky things in JavaScript. There are two ways to check equality, but I really say you should always use one. Use triple equals. Do not use double equals. Real quick, single equals is assignment. Right? So when you are creating variables, you let some variable equal to something. So when you write one equals to JavaScript, that means you are assigning something. Okay. When you're writing 2 or 3 equals, or really just 3 equals, that means you're checking if 2 things are equal. And this will evaluate to a Boolean, a true or false value. Okay? So 2 equals 2 is basically the same as writing true. Okay? 2 equals 2 is also the same as writing 2. But the reason why I say you should always use 3 equals is because 2 is less safe. It can result in unexpected kind of behavior in your program. Basically, how it works is 2 will coerce the 2 things on both sides. It will just basically force the 2 things on both sides of the equals operator to be the same type. So you can see 2 equals, the string 2 is false, which makes sense. That number is not equal to a string. But 2 equals, the string 2, is true. And so this might seem tempting to use, but in general, this is much, much more dangerous. So I would highly recommend never ever using double equals and always use triple equals, because you can always write better code that doesn't require you to compare strings and numbers. Just a real quick aside, we're going to dive a little deeper into this for those of you who know a little more about programming. Basically, this is a value check for primitives, reference checks for objects. Primitives being those types that we talked about, numbers, strings, etc. And they just check the value of those. But if you're creating objects, it's a reference check. So you can see here, if I created 2 objects, both with the name Monday, okay, they basically look like the same object, but if you equals them, it's false, because they're not actually pointing to the same object. And what that means is, let's say you have these 2 lines of code. Then somewhere in like memory or fake JavaScript land, okay, this is what's kind of happening. It's saying person 1 points to this object, right? And person 2 points to this object. And you can see they're essentially the same, the objects look the same, but they are not the same object. It's like saying, like, if I pulled out an iPhone here and you had an iPhone of the same model, right? Just because they're the same, they look the same, doesn't mean they are physically the same object, okay? And that's kind of what's going on here. Cool. So if you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. It probably is not relevant anyways, but it is important. So yeah, back to triple equals, value checks for primitives, reference checks for objects, semicolons, okay? So JavaScript is notoriously known for being really loose and like free and like lets you do a lot of things. That's not always the best thing because it lets you write a lot of bad code. So semicolons aren't strictly necessary in JavaScript. So if you don't write a semicolon at the end of your line, by the way, I guess I never mentioned this, you should write a semicolon at the end of every single statement. Okay? Basically, it's kind of like a period for a sentence in English or like that. But you should always be doing this because, again, this can lead to unintended consequences. JavaScript might interpret your code as if like your code is running for like multiple lines if you didn't write it correctly and didn't end it with a semicolon. So always just have a semicolon at the end of a statement. Next up is callback functions. This is a little more exciting, a little more complicated. Before we get into that, questions? All good? Cool. All right. So yeah, callback functions. You will be using this a lot. Okay. This is like extremely common in web development. So if you have been checking out, check back in for this one. So yeah, callback functions is a function that's basically passed as an argument to another function. Now that's a mouthful. What that basically means is when you have functions, you have arguments. Arguments are basically things you pass to the function. And in JavaScript, you can pass functions to functions. What does that look like? Well, let's look at it. Here we have two functions defined. The first one is pretty simple. It adds 2 to a value. You give it x, it'll add 2 to x, and return that. Okay? The second function is a little more complicated. It takes in an array, okay? And I just named that variable array. It can be named A, it can be named B, it doesn't have to be named array. And then I also gave it a parameter called callback, okay? And again, that can be called anything. It could be C, D, whatever you want. I call it callback to make it nice and readable, okay? And so what this function does, before I actually explain what's going on in the code, and maybe you already understand it, it takes an array, it takes a function, and it applies applies the function to every single element in the array, and then stores that into array, okay? And then returns that array to you. Okay? Or actually doesn't return the array, it just modifies it, okay? So you can see in this one, what it's doing is basically just looping through the array, okay? And calling the callback function on each array's index, and then storing that value back into that index. By the way, you can store things into arrays by putting on the left hand of an assignment. So array I, and then equals, basically saying, hey, put this value in this index of this array. So finally, if we go here, we can just like kind of walk through this. I create an array, 5, 15, 25, 35, and I call modify array on my array and add 2. Note that when I pass in the function add 2, I pass it in without any parentheses. I just give the name of the function. Because we'll talk about this in a bit, but basically, this is a function with the parentheses, it would be a function call. But basically, what is it doing? So it takes 5, 15, 25, 35, it gives its function, it goes in there, it iterates through it, okay? And it calls callback, which is add 2, so it calls add 2 on array 0, which is 5. So it says add 2 to 5, return 7. Put 7 in array 0, so now array 0 is 7. Goes to the next one. Does the same thing to 15, puts 17 in the first index. So yeah, so you get, at the end, you get 7, 17, 27, 37. Okay? And that's what's in my array. Cool? Questions? Cool. So yeah, like I mentioned, add 2 is a function. Add 2 of some parentheses, of some value, is a function call. Remember that evaluates to some value. It returns a number. Okay? So, basically, what I just showed you, it seems like a little cumbersome. It seems like a lot of words for writing what's a pretty simple idea. So there are ways to shorten this, and this is called anonymous functions. And anonymous functions are basically functions that don't have names. They're usually short, really quick functions that you use to quickly create something or create some function that you're going to pass to something but never use again. That's the point of anonymous functions. You never will use them again, so you're writing them once in your code. If you're ever writing them more than once in your code, you don't want to make it anonymous. Okay? But, so for example here, we basically still have the modify array, and nothing's changed about that, and we still have my array. But in the modify array function call on line 8, we're passing in the first argument, which is my array. The second argument, we're actually defining the function right there and passing it into this JavaScript function. So how do we do that? We literally just define it as you would. We say function of x, and then curly braces, return x plus 2. And don't forget, at the end of that, you should have the parentheses, which is closing this function call, and the semicolon, which is ending that statement. Okay? And so yeah, you can see now it kind of maybe makes the code a little harder to read-ish, but not really, because it's once you start seeing this a lot, you get used to this very quickly. And the truth is, this can be shortened even more into a really nice thing called an arrow function or a lambda function. And basically, this is just a shorthand way of writing these anonymous functions, okay? And you can write it in this format. I want you to understand that this is basically the same exact thing as what we just did. I'm pretty sure JavaScript interprets it basically the same way. But the idea is that this is a variable that you're creating. This is creating a function, this statement right here, and it says x, and you want to take that and add 2 to x, okay? And these, like 6 characters or so, basically make up a function, okay? Does that make sense? The special operator here is this arrow operator, which is equals, and this is greater than. Yeah. And so that basically kind of looks like an arrow and saying, hey, this is a function. I want you to take x and add 2 to it and return it. Okay? That's what this is doing. And so we went from here to here to here, and you can see it really shortens things down. And this can be very useful, especially for something as simple as adding 2 to every element. Okay? There are also other ways to do this, but I'm not going to get into streaming and things like that. But if you know anything about like mapping, reducing, and things like that, you can also do that in JavaScript. I'd say look it up. Cool. So what does that actually tell us? Well, it tells us that it basically is always some tool that makes your life easier. With a caveat that giving you understanding. Okay? So these tools will really help you all the time, but make sure that you guys get a good understanding of how these things work before you try diving into this kind of content. So any questions about that so far? What's up?
In your modified array, do you actually return them at
This one?
Yeah.
So yeah, again, because this is a shorthand, you don't need to actually return in this shorthand version. It implies that this is being returned.
That array is being returned when you call it modified array.
Oh, sorry. Oh, that's what you mean. Oh, no, so you don't need to return the array. You can, but basically what modify array as a function is doing is it's modifying the given array, okay? And there's nowhere that we've actually, you could if you wanted to, but there's nowhere actually saying that like, I need to return this array. Because if you now go and like print my array after this, that is the array that will have been modified. And so it will have 7, 17, 27, 37 already in it. If we wanted to return it, we could. But that's just like how you define a function, okay? Any other questions? Cool, all right. So with that, let's just really quickly go through some good practices for programming, and then we can step out for lunch. So first of all, you always, again, I already talked about this, always want to use triple equals for equality checking. You want to end each statement with a semicolon. When you're creating a new variable, use the let keyword. When creating a new constant, use the const keyword. Avoid the var keyword. And camel case your variables. Okay? And you can always get back to these slides. They will be posted online. Indenting. Make sure you use 2 or 4 space tabs and be consistent. And I'd say don't actually use tabs, use spaces. Like use 2 spaces or 4 spaces. By the way, if you use a nice code editor like VS Code, it will automatically do this for you. Okay? Okay. So we're going to get into playing with HTML, but should we break for lunch or should we?
Lunch is here. Depends on. Do you want to? We can break for lunch now. Lunch is
I think this is probably a good point to break.
okay.
All right, cool. I'll see you guys after lunch. All right, hey guys, welcome back. We're just going to quickly wrap up some more stuff with JavaScript. Now, we've talked a lot about how JavaScript is written and things like that. We actually haven't talked anything about web development yet. So we're going to talk about how we use JavaScript to interact with your HTML and maybe even your CSS and things like that. And that'll take a little bit, and then we're going to dive straight into a workshop where you guys will be coding just kind of similar to yesterday with one example, and we'll be starting to work on Calculate and actually like starting to build it from the first phase. So yeah, with that, let's keep going. So yeah, so if you remember, this was my take on JavaScript. It's making things happen with boxes. So it's actually time to make things happen. So what does that actually mean? Well, how do you interact with boxes? Well, you can basically modify elements on a web page. You can create elements on a web page. And you can give elements actions on a web page. These are all things that you can do with JavaScript. And a few more stuff, but these are just some pretty like central examples of things you should be able to do with JavaScript. So this right here is probably the #1 most important line of code that you'll be using in your JavaScript. It's called this function, document.getElementById. Okay? And this is basically how you interact with your HTML from JavaScript. Quick note, some of you may have some experience in the background of like working with web development before. Maybe you've used something called jQuery. Maybe you've seen something called a $sign in code. We do not use that here. It's no good. So don't worry, we'll be teaching you exactly how to do everything using just plain, simple JavaScript. And then eventually when we get to like things like advanced topics like next week, maybe React and things like that, you'll start to see how you might work around something like this. But yeah, for now, you can see that we can represent elements in our HTML page in JavaScript. So basically there's probably some element with an ID, identifier, on our HTML page, and we saved it and stored it in this variable that we called L. Note that I actually went ahead and set this as a constant variable, and that's because, well, you're not actually ever going to be reassigning this element. For those of you, again, who know referential, like how variables work in terms of references, this is a reference to that object, which is part of the DOM or the web page. And so when you modify that, you can modify properties of the object, but you're never going to be reassigning this variable, which is why it's perfectly fine and a good thing to use constants in this case. Oh, is my computer frozen? Yeah. That's fun. Hey, Jessica.
Yes.
Wow. This is new. This has never happened. All right. Well, while I restart my computer, that's fun. While I restart my computer, does anyone have any thoughts? Okay, so anyone know anything about what you can do with JavaScript? Maybe anyone want to tell me some examples of things you can do with JavaScript on a web page? I'm sure you guys know some things. Bear with me as I hit the button. I hope my computer turns on. It's not dead forever. All right, okay, you guys are great at this interaction portion. All right, you know what? I'm gonna make you guys all interact, okay? Here, everyone, raise your hands. Do it, just do it. Okay, raise your hands, okay? All right, hold your hands out in front of you like this, okay? Palms facing together, fingers nicely widespread. Okay, cross them over like this, okay? Turn them upside down and clasp them together. Make sure those fingers are nicely intertwined. Okay, everyone got that? Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, back.
He doesn't think right. He's like, make sure you do it correctly. I think he just goes.
You got me though. I don't
Just like,
How about this? 3, 2, 1.
Cool. All right. We got. All right.
No, that's
So, guys, one little thing. Anyways, that has nothing to do with HTML or CSS. Well, maybe there's like a metaphor there. I don't really know. All right. So we're gonna go back to the slide. We're here. Present. Okay. Hopefully it doesn't die on me again. So yeah. Okay. So we were at the slide. So next up. So yeah, you can modify these elements in the HTML using this tool. So you can see I did L, short for element, dot inner HTML, and then set that equal to some text, right? And it's basically the same as putting some text in between those two HTML tags, right? And so that's exactly what this does. And don't worry, you will be doing this in our workshop, so you don't need to like worry about memorizing this right now. You get some practice with it too. So yeah, you can change the content, styling, or structure of elements. It's not just the just the text inside. You can do a lot of different things. So you can also create new elements. So for example, there's a function called document.createElement, and then you give it the type of the tag that you want to create. So this time we're creating a div, and I put it into a constant again because it's not like we're reassigning this variable. And in this new element, I've added some inner HTML. Hi. By the way, just to make it clear, when you do document.createElement, you haven't actually put the element anywhere yet. This is just a function to create a type of element. And then you're going to put that element when you append it to the previous element. So there's this function called Append Child, which lets you just insert tags as a child of the current tag. Okay? And it's called Append Child because it inserts it at the last child, as the last child of that. Just so you understand what that means, like, let's say you have a web page, you have body, right? And you have a bunch of tags inside that body, and there's a bunch of subtags in there too. if you appended a child to body, it would put itself at the very bottom of the document. And that's what append child does. Okay? So yeah, here in theory, this identifier tag should have now a child. That's a new div tag at the very bottom. You can also give elements actions in HTML. So what that means is basically you can add event listeners, which is something that is just kind of terminology we use in JavaScript and HTML. But you can see here that we've found a button on the web page, okay? And it doesn't actually need to be a button, it could be any element, okay? But you found that by getting the element by its ID. And then we are saying add event listener, and it takes two parameters, okay? Click and a function. So you can actually see this is the example of an anonymous function, okay? So here we're just creating a function that all it does is it does this thing called alert. It calls a function called alert and takes in the string hi. So for those of you who don't know what this does, alert is basically equivalent to the little pop-up that shows up when you go into a web page, okay? And so yeah, you can find a button and give it an action every time someone clicks it. So in theory, this button, now whenever someone clicks it, will create a pop-up. And don't worry, you'll be doing this in the workshop as well. So yeah, putting it all together, you can really start to see how this can start making your web page very dynamic, very interactive, because here we're doing a bunch of things. So first, we're finding a couple of elements. First, just some random element that like we're going to be calling some kind of container, and then some button, okay? Then every time we click on the button, we're creating a new div, setting the inside of it to be hi, and then appending it to that container. So basically, you can imagine like if you just keep clicking on this button, you'll get a really long list of like hi's, basically. Okay? That's kind of what this is doing. Does that make sense? Any of you have questions on this code? Again, we'll be doing something very similar in the workshop. Cool. So in conclusion, you can use JavaScript to interact with these boxes by like adding and removing divs and other elements. You can get the context of a text box. This is really important, by the way. Anytime you have forms and you want to submit the form, you can find the text box by some ID and like get the text inside of it, and that's like really useful. You can add and remove classes, which is really useful for if you want to like change the styling of an element on the fly. You can like have a button, and then like maybe when someone clicks it, you can change the class of the button so that's like submitted, or you can change the class so it's disabled, and then you can disable the button as soon as someone clicks it. You can change the CSS directly. You can, I believe, I forget the exact terminology, but I think this is in the workshop. But you can set the style of element directly through CSS, through the JavaScript by writing some CSS in it. And then, of course, you can give them actions or add listeners to do things on certain actions. And I've only shown click, but there are several actions out there, and you can find that online. So yeah, finally the last thing, of course, just like we talked about how you link your CSS to your HTML, you also have to link your JavaScript to your HTML, or else there's like no way that your browser will know that they want to load this JavaScript for this page. And so this is how you do it. You say script, you create a script tag, okay? And again, same idea, you have a source, and it points to the location of the file. In this case, we put it in some folder /static/js/index.js, but you don't need to worry about that for now. But that's just where I put the location of the file. Okay? Now, one thing about this is you want to load your scripts at the end of your HTML file. Note that I said that a good place to put a lot of things is in the head of your HTML. Remember, your HTML has two parts, a head and a body. This is the one exception, often. If you put your script at the end of your HTML file, it actually loads there. Okay? So one thing that's nice about that, and you won't understand it quite yet, but it's very useful when we start programming it, is that you want your entire web page to load before you load your JavaScript. And HTML loads in order. Okay? So what does that mean? Basically, let's say you want to find an element with an ID, right? And that element is on your HTML web page. But if your web page isn't loaded, you might have a lot of errors where it's like, I can't find this element, it doesn't exist, okay? And that happens all the time, trust me. I ran into this problem so many times when I was taking this class, and I've seen people run into this problem when they take this class. And the idea is that you just need to make sure that your document has loaded. There's a couple ways to do this, and you will find solutions online that say like, hey, wait for document to load and then run your JavaScript. Or this is the simpler way, you just put your JavaScript at the bottom of the file, and it'll just do that automatically. Cool, so that's it for now. We're gonna move on to a workshop, which will be run by Jessica over there. So yeah, thank you guys, and we'll see you guys in a bit. Did you stop the camera?